Colors! Everyone loves colors. Look at them, they're flashy, they're pretty, and they really make an illustration pop. So what if we want to make gorgeous illustrations like these? We'll just need to study colors until... Wait, stop. I know colors are awesome, but what if I told you there's something way more important than colors? There are people out there that say you shouldn't even touch colors before you master this. So what I'm referring to is values, which is part of what makes a color. In short, it's the lightness or darkness of a color. These colors have light values, and these ones have dark values. And that's about it. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye! So what about it? Black and white images are so boring compared to colorful ones. Why should we care about values? Have you ever spent a ton of time zooming in on an image and rendering out a ton of details, and then you finally post it on social media, and when you look at the thumbnail, you can't really tell what's going on? Usually, the reason for this is that you didn't get your values right, which means that your composition might be unfocused or hard to read. And here's an interesting thing. As long as you get your values right in an illustration, it actually doesn't really matter what the hues are.
Nani?
Take a look at this illustration. Even just in black and white, the illustration is very clear and readable. But you might be interested to know that the artist actually drew this with her monitor set to black and white. So she actually had no idea what colors she was using until she turned the colors back on. Like this. Whoa, those colors are wild! But somehow it all still works in a weird way. And that's the power of good values. Here's a really interesting thing. As long as you get your values right in an illustration, what the actual hues are don't matter as much. They still matter, just not as much. I think one important concept to think about with values is the concept of grouping your values. Grouping your values is important to make sure your overall composition is readable and appealing. And you want to consider the proportions of values and shapes to make sure it looks appealing overall, even before you add any kind of detail. For example, let's look at Thomas Kinkade. Okay, let's stop for a second. If these paintings look lovely and wonderful to you and you want your art to look like this, that's fantastic. Kinkade had incredible commercial success and his paintings were massively popular. It's just not exactly to my taste, so I won't be learning to paint like him today. If we try comparing his work to Ray Roberts, again, a lot of this depends on personal preference, but I like this a lot more. The difference becomes especially clear when we change their work to black and white. With Ray Roberts, you can see clear and distinct value blocks. His value control is a lot tighter and more precise. This is much harder to do with Kinkade's work, where the values are a lot more broken up. Great splash art for video games also has clear and distinct value blocks. So being able to group values is important to creating clear and compelling compositions. And honestly, I've just never really been very good at that. I've mostly focused on doing line work, so painting and shading has always been one of my major weaknesses. So it's time to change that by practicing. I'm going to try doing value studies. Basically, the idea here is you find some kind of image to copy and try to simplify it down into a small number of values. I'm choosing 3, but some people choose 2 or 4, depending on their goals for the study. Remember to use a hard brush for this. To be honest, I'm not really sure what these studies are called. I've heard them called distillation studies or simply 3 value studies. I started by grabbing stills from filmgrab.com, but paintings also work. Either way, you want to pick an image that was designed by someone. In the case of movie stills, the director. You don't want to be grabbing random photographs. Anyway, this is my first time doing it, but it doesn't look too hard, right? I just made all the images grayscale and went for it. So one trick I know when it comes to value is that squinting is a really useful tool in helping you group values. If you squint super hard, everything looks blurry, which means that instead of getting caught up in small details like reflected light, you can only see these big value blocks. These are the blocks you should be trying to capture. So I just squinted away and started copying what I saw. But it was actually a lot harder than I expected, especially when I was working with soft gradients like this. Where was I supposed to put the edges in these cases? There was also this image over here. I just started copying it as usual, but somehow it just wasn't very clear. It was hard to tell what was going on. I couldn't get the bridge to stand out from the background. Was I going about this the wrong way somehow? And the answer is, actually, I was. I was supposed to be doing these 3 value studies with the source image in color, not in black and white. By making them monochrome, I was simply copying the values I saw and not much else. Now, film stills are color graded very intentionally to tell a story, so by looking at them only in black and white, I was missing out on that story. When I finally changed them back to color, suddenly it made a lot more sense. Look at these mountains in the background. In black and white, the value is not too different from the bridge in the foreground, and they kinda just blend together. However, in color, it's clear that the foreground is much warmer than the background, so they look very distinct. So I decided to keep them distinct as well when I was doing my value studies. When doing these, it's important to not only look at the value, but also to pay attention to the intent the director had. So keeping this in mind, I also turned this soft gradient into a circle shape. Another example is here, these blurry elements on the outside. While there's certainly value differences here, they are unfocused and it's clear that the intent isn't to draw attention to them. So now that I was properly armed with a basic understanding of intent, I was ready to try again and actually do the study right this time. Okay, one more time, but this time I kept the source images in color. I still occasionally changed them to monochrome when I was uncertain, but for the most part, I tried to focus on what I thought the intent of the shot was. I think that really helped. My studies are getting a lot more readable, and it was going great until I encountered this image. Unlike some of the previous images, there weren't any very clear and obvious blocks of values. There was just a lot going on. How could I possibly capture all of this with just 3 values? What was the correct answer? But here's where I realized something that never actually crossed my mind before. I had been approaching these studies a bit like math problems. I thought that there was one single correct answer out there that I was looking for, when in reality, there are a lot of different interpretations out there that are equally valid. They're very different, clearly, but they're both actually still correct. It just depends on which parts of the image you want to emphasize. And that was the key to my issues. It's not only the intent of the director I needed to think about, I had to think about my own intentions as well. What did I want to emphasize? What did I want to focus on? At this point, I was feeling a lot better about my studies. It felt like I was almost done, and I had gotten a lot better at distilling and understanding how to group values. Except, yet again, there was one major issue that I didn't notice until I had completed the set of studies. None of my values were accurate. For example, look at this image. If you switch the source image to black and white, look at the value in the HSB slider. If you compare it to mine is so much lighter. And this one over here, the woman's shirt is clearly too pale. I was getting so carried away with intent that I was getting sloppy. I had forgotten about accuracy. So, one last time, but this time, I needed to put everything together. I needed to study the source images in color and pay attention to intents. And I had to do all of that while keeping my values accurate as well. I spent an extra long time to make sure they were accurate this time. I squinted a ton to make sure they looked correct. This took ages, but in the end, I think it was worth it. I felt like I was finally getting a handle on how to do these. I finished them off and proudly posted them on the website formerly known as Twitter and promptly got a paint over, which just goes to show I have a very long way to go. But that's okay. I might not be great at values yet, but at least I'm better than I was before. By the way, you don't only have to study from movie stills. Paintings from old masters are great to study from as well. Sargent has incredible value control, so I also did a few studies from his paintings. These kinds of studies are particularly good for practicing your own preferences and intentions. There are actually a ton of ways to distill this painting into 3 values. 2 other friends of mine did a study from this exact same painting. Look at how different they look. Mine's clearly not as good as theirs, but that's okay. We don't compare with others here. But some important things to pay attention to are the overall ratios of different values and shadow shapes. This is where shape design comes into play. So now to test myself on what I learned. I challenged myself to create a sketch with just 3 values, but it needed to be clear, readable, and appealing from any size. I decided to draw one of my favorite monsters from Monster Hunter, Mizutsune. I started with a sketch, of course. I'm the kind of artist who thinks with lines, so I can't go straight in with values like some other artists can. Once I was finished the sketch, then I started blocking in some values. I started with only 2 values and tried to pay attention to the big shapes first. I was actually getting pretty worried about the top of the drawing, since I was worried that Mizutsune's distinctive head fins were getting lost in the rest of the body, but adding 1 more value helped pick out the silhouette of the head more clearly. After establishing my large shadow shapes, I had to be careful not to break them up. I spent quite a lot of time adding new shadow shapes and just erasing them later on when I realized they didn't look good. Afterwards, I cleaned up the shapes, added more detail, and finally, the moment of truth. I deleted the line art layer, and here's how it looks really small. Hey, that's not too bad. It's not perfect, of course, but I think even with 3 values, it's pretty easy to tell what's going on. Maybe I'll turn it into a full illustration later on. If you want to find more information about value and color, a really good teacher is Devin Corwin. You can find a lot of his classes at Underpaint Academy. Anyway, if this video was helpful, try doing a 3-value study of the subscribe button. And stay tuned for part 2 when I finally start learning how to apply color. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye! Bye-bye-bye-bye-bye-bye-bye.